The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. We will start this section of the video with a quick recap of the year 2000. In the year 2000, Kurt finally released his long-awaited solo project album, Christotomy. Unbeknownst to fans, he completely changed the album from what it was originally intended to be, removing key radio single songs and replacing them with relentless noise rock as a spiteful move for much of the album's bootlegged live versions being leaked online without his permission. He figured he'd release an album nobody wants. Doing so effectively pulls Kurt out of the mainstream, and he spends much of 2000 being reclusive, doing drugs, and sitting at home in his own mess. Kurt had scheduled a small tour around the US at relatively small venues to support his album, but cancels the tour after a few shows. Kurt has befriended artists like Noel Gallagher and Paul McCartney. By the end of 2000, Kurt has no intentions on ever returning to the US. He plans on staying in the UK, overseas, far away from the grasps of American media. After various magazines and tabloid outlets completely picked apart his new album, eventually the buzz dies off, and Kurt is left alone for much of the year, where he can remain out of the spotlight. This brings us to 2001. January 2001. By the beginning of the year, Kurt has been relatively out of the mainstream spotlight for quite some time. He hasn't been seen or heard from in the public eye since the release of Christotomy, and the initial reviews that followed after its release. The landscape of popular music is changing, with MTV playing less rock and alternative music and playing more hip-hop and R&B, as well as reality-based television. MTV itself is slowly moving away from music and becoming more of a general multimedia platform for entertainment. Although by this time, in 2001, much music in Canada is still very much musically focused in keeping mainstream rock music at the forefront, as they've recently done a Much Music Spotlight episode on Kurt Cobain, which featured much of Nirvana's videos as well as Kurt Cobain's video for Lavender. Even so, it seems as if the quote-unquote grunge heyday is officially over by the beginning of the decade. In our real timeline, it seems that Kurt Cobain himself has changed the landscape of music twice. First, when Nevermind came out and alternative music completely took over the mainstream, it was inevitably changed again when he died in 1994. The landscape of alternative rock is similar in this timeline, but with slight changes. Grunge and alternative stayed in the mainstream well into the late 90s, with Kurt still being alive. And with Rohypnol coming out in 1996, it kept the Nirvana fan base interested in the band well into the late 90s, even after the inevitable breakup of the band shortly after its release. It wasn't until the release of Cobain's much-anticipated Christotomy in 2000 that the general audience of casual listeners have given up hope on getting something they've been waiting for since 1996. The alternative grunge scene slowly started to diminish after that album, with many fans believing that album marks the end of an era. Kurt effectively changes the landscape of music twice, in both timelines. By late January of 2001, while PJ Harvey is still on tour for her latest album, Kurt has been hanging out with friends, including Noel Gallagher and occasionally Robert Smith of The Cure. Kurt is noted as saying he doesn't care about the state of the United States and that he didn't vote because he has no intentions on ever returning to the United States at this point. He does, however, mention that Americans should have banded together and voted for quote-unquote the global warming guy, and that putting Bush in office will most likely result in some form of inescapable disaster. February 2001. Kurt's birthday arrives. He is now 34 years old, and his girlfriend at the time, PJ Harvey, is not present to celebrate with him, as she is still on her European tour to support her new album. Although the two occasionally talk over the phone. Kurt spends his birthday with Frances Bean, and he is invited to a small gathering that night with Paul McCartney. He agrees to attend and attempts to find a babysitter for Frances Bean. Paul then tells Kurt that's not necessary, as he can bring Frances Bean, and the two are welcome to spend the night. Paul claims that he's too old to go crazy and pull all-nighters doing drugs and alcohol, which is shrugged off as a joke to both of them. Kurt agrees and attends Paul's party. In late February of 2001, an episode of VH1 Behind the Music is released. This episode is about the careers of Nirvana members and Cobain himself. Some parts of the episode are scathing towards Cobain, depicting him as a lazy junkie who derailed his own career multiple times. While some of these things stated in the episode happened to be true, none of this was brought to Kurt's attention. And since he's been living in London for the time being, he hasn't been watching much television, especially MTV or VH1. He chooses to stay away from it at this time. He doesn't want to know what's going on in the world of mainstream music right now. He finds himself happier when being a rock star doesn't concern him. Kurt loves the UK. The UK was really the first large group of people who had responded to Kurt's music and Nirvana back in their heyday. A lot of the bands from Britain and the surrounding areas are some of Kurt's major influence. He has no plans on returning to the US at this time, to be assaulted by the press. He is still considering selling his house, but has since realized the amount of money he's making just by renting out the studio to small-time producers and bands. Even if Kurt doesn't continue with his music career, having that rentable studio space alone could keep him financially afloat in the coming years. His studio is a hot commodity. March 2001. Kurt has spent the last few months virtually alone in London, other than the occasional meetups with friends. Unfortunately, due to Kurt's extensive free time alone at home, he has once again started to use more opioids and downer medications. He would sit in the small bedroom studio he crafted into Harvey's house with Frances while she makes songs on his guitars. He would often nod off in the chair and wake up hours later to her still making music. He figured it was safe to have his quote-unquote naps while she sat in the studio, knowing she would be safe there with him sleeping. He never saw it as a big deal. Later in the month, Kurt would be contacted by Lane Staley, who apologizes for not getting back to him sooner. Lane would state that he hasn't been the best friend to many of his friends, not returning calls and not attempting to reach out to anyone. He also states that he has yet to get clean. Kurt immediately changes the subject, as the mere mention of heroin gives him severe anxiety, and he starts taking more pills to relax his brain. Lane does mention that he loved Cobain's latest album, Christotomy, and he admires the absolute disdain for the music industry. Kurt mentions that Lane should make a point to give some of his friends a call before the conversation ends. Lane, however, neglects to do so. On March 30th, 2001, Kurt is once again invited to Paul McCartney's home, this time to work on some music together. Kurt hasn't really put much thought into making new music since the so-called quote-unquote train wreck that was Christotomy. Although it's known that Kurt has the masters of the original song listing for that album at his home studio in LA. Although he hasn't put much time into thinking about music lately. This is Paul McCartney of the Beatles. Kurt simply couldn't say no. Cobain makes plans to make a trip to Paul's house in the following weeks. He plans on bringing Frances along with him. April 2001. Kurt and Frances arrive at Paul's house. They spend most of the day just chatting and listening to Paul's Beatles stories. Kurt was more than happy to sit and listen, smoking almost a full pack of cigarettes while sitting at the kitchen table. Paul then mentions they should retreat to the basement and work on a song together. Kurt agrees. For the remainder of the evening, the two just sit and jam on guitar in the basement. No actual song is written, and nothing is recorded. But it got Kurt out of his funk, and made him want to start making music again. Before leaving for the night, Kurt asks how he can get in touch with George Harrison. Paul laughs and tells Kurt that he and George have had a somewhat estranged relationship for quite some time, but have reconciled in the recent years. He also informs Kurt that George hasn't been in the greatest health as of late, and isn't sure if he's willing to meet new people. He does, however, leave Kurt with George's phone number to contact him, just in case. By mid-April, Kurt is back at PJ Harvey's home in London. At this time, Harvey returns home from her European tour a few days earlier than expected due to an illness within her touring band. 3 European tour dates are canceled. Upon arriving home, she is greeted first by Frances Bean, who tells her to be quiet coming in because, quote-unquote, Dad is asleep. Harvey enters the bedroom area where Kurt is asleep and is unable to wake him up. He is completely unresponsive. She leaves the room and enters again about 10 minutes later, still to no response from Kurt. She begins to shout his name louder and louder with every attempt to wake him, while Frances stands in the doorway observing what is happening. Kurt is completely out of it. Harvey begins to worry and asks Frances what Kurt's been up to while she's been away, to which Frances responds, quote-unquote, I don't know. He takes a lot of naps. It's clear that Kurt is in some type of drug-induced sleep coma. He's fine, not in any immediate danger to his health, but it is concerning to Harvey, as she has dealt with drug addiction problems in the past. She doesn't want to blame Kurt for it, but is concerned since he was solely in the care of Frances, who was only 8 years old at this time. She will be 9 this summer. Kurt eventually wakes up nearly a half hour after Harvey initially tried to wake him up. She isn't overly aggressive with him about it, but an argument ensues. It's clear Kurt woke up cranky from his nap. This would be the first argument they have had, with Kurt being fully defensive against any type of allegations of drugs from Harvey's end, even though Kurt knows damn well he took some pills and completely passed out. Frances doesn't want to listen to the two argue and leaves the house to sit on the front step. PJ states that she cares for Kurt very much and can't sit back and watch him go down that road again. He spent the last 6 or 7 years virtually clean of drugs, to her knowledge. But it is known that Kurt is still heavily into downer meds and different sleep aids, and that he just hides it well. But now, it's becoming apparent to PJ Harvey that Kurt is not clean, and still struggling with addictions. She knows it's not entirely his fault, and she can't blame him for it. Harvey opts to give Kurt another chance, and the argument ends when Kurt realized Frances was nowhere to be seen. He then cuts the conversation short and says, quote-unquote, where the fuck is Frances? The two then leave the room and start searching around the house for Kurt's daughter. They eventually find Frances sitting out back peacefully pulling petals from the flowers. Harvey gives Kurt a moment to sit and talk with his daughter. During the conversation, Frances states that she just wants everyone to love each other and that she's tired of everyone being mad all the time. She tells her father she's not having as much fun as she used to, with PJ being on tour and Kurt napping all the time. She's basically left to her own devices. She's not aware of the drug use, nor is she aware of the effects that drugs can do to a person. She is still just an innocent 8-year-old girl with a bright future of her own ahead of her. She tells Kurt she thinks right now is a good time to go see her mother. and that she feels bad for not keeping in contact with Courtney. She feels like it's not fair that Kurt gets all the time with her, and he uses it to nod off and go to sleep. She would go on to explain that it is nothing against Kurt and that she loves him very much. She also loves Polly, but she feels as if she's neglected her mother and she wants to spend some time in the United States to see her. Kurt explains that he can't keep her away from the things that she wants to do. That would make him a bad father, something he never dreamed of being. And he tells Frances that he will make travel arrangements to fly her back out to the United States to see her mother, on one condition: that she eventually comes back to him, as he loves her so much. The thought of losing his daughter crushes him deeply. She responds with a simple, "Of course." And it is decided that Kurt will accompany Frances to the United States in the beginning of May, and he will arrange for a trusted nanny to bring her to Courtney's, as Kurt still has no desire to see Courtney at this moment. May 2001. In the beginning of the month, PJ Harvey embarks on her United States tour. She will do 3 months across the country. Kurt flies back home to the US with Frances so he can set up a meeting with Courtney to take her, at Frances' request. Kurt knows he's going to be left alone for a while. No girlfriend and no daughter. It will just be him for the foreseeable future. That's both a good and bad thing in his eyes. Although Kurt does plan on attending a few of Harvey's shows around the United States, he doesn't plan on staying in the US very long, as he wants to go back to the UK where he feels more comfortable living outside of the spotlight. He has also accumulated a few new friends while in London, and he plans on spending more time with them. While in the US, awaiting for word from Courtney, Kurt decides to revamp his studio for future projects and to make it easier for producers to come and go. He adds a couple home PC computers to the house for the first time, no longer relying on analog technology. On these computers, he has CD-ROMs burnt with his master files on them, so he can take them back to London with him to continue working on some unfinished music. Also on these computers is the unreleased Christotomy songs he consciously left off the album in the wake of the Napster leaks. From now on, everything he needs is conveniently in one place. This will make things easier for Kurt. Now he can take these burned CDs and bring them over to Paul's house to finally show him the songs he's been working on. A few days later, Kurt contacts Courtney so he can arrange to have Frances dropped off. Courtney now resides in LA, only a few miles away from Kurt's home in the US, just outside of LA. Courtney picks up the phone after Kurt gets the runaround with one of Courtney's social workers. He tried multiple times to get a hold of her, only to be told she's not taking any calls, even after he told them who he was. After picking up the phone, Kurt and Courtney speak to each other for the first time since the court date in October of 2000. They have a lengthy conversation, about 45 minutes long. The contents of the conversation are not known, but it is decided that Kurt will make the meeting with Courtney, and the two agree there's no need to get a nanny involved. And Courtney welcomes Kurt to her temporary group house to drop off Frances. It took Kurt some convincing. He really didn't think it was going to be a good idea, and wasn't sure about how his current girlfriend would feel about it. But in the end, he eventually agreed. There are a few social workers around, and Courtney is never really alone at the time due to her sentencing. But she will be able to spend time with Frances freely, which is what Frances and Courtney both want at this time. In the following weeks, Kurt would personally drive his daughter out to LA to see her mother, Courtney Love. He would return to pick Frances up whenever she wishes to come back to him, which she initially promised to her father. Kurt meets with Courtney, but does not tell PJ Harvey he's going. Her tour begins in the US the same day, starting in Manhattan, somewhere she's always wanted to move to. Kurt didn't fly out to be with her at the first show of her tour, but plans to do so later on. June 2001. A new book and documentary is being planned by a small group of conspiracy theorists called The Truth. The book aims to slam Courtney Love and will cover all of her exploits and controversies, including her criminal charges and sentencing, as well as theories of plotting to have her ex-husband killed in the peak of his career in 1994, as well as sending hired goons to his house in 1998, along with her various doomed relationships with different rock stars and celebrities. It will go into detail about Courtney's skill of manipulating the media to fit her narrative. The book and documentary will be titled Love Hurts and is hoped to be released before the end of 2001. Chris Novoselic does an interview with Low End magazine. In the interview, he's asked about his time in Nirvana. In the interview, he states that his time in Nirvana was the best years of his life, and he really wishes the short time in which Nirvana was the head of the mainstream lasted just a bit longer. He claims to have talked to Dave only a handful of times since Nirvana's inevitable breakup in 1996, and that he is happy about the success Dave has found on his own. He goes on to talk about Kurt and how good it is to see Kurt still doing his thing. He says that Kurt can go off and do anything he wants, and he will be successful. Chris then states that he would absolutely love to work with Kurt again in the future, but the prospect of that happening is very slim. He claims Nirvana is dead, and the version of Nirvana that fans knew and loved from the early 90s is gone forever. He reiterates that doesn't mean a collaboration of sorts is off the table entirely. Kurt, who's been back in London during this time, is set to fly back to his home in LA to meet with Elliott Smith to produce a 2-song single for Smith. The two have spoken over the phone a handful of times. An unknown mutual friend set up the initial phone call, with Smith being the one to contact Kurt Cobain. Kurt, being in the UK at the time and being out of touch with music entirely at this time, didn't really know who Elliott was, but accepted the task because he was quote-unquote bored with life, considering Harvey is on tour and Frances is with her mother, Courtney. He is just looking for something to do. Kurt will arrive back in the United States on June 24th, 2001. The initial recording will take 1 day, and the mixing throughout the rest of the week. While at home, Kurt makes an arrangement to rent out the studio to the band The Strokes. Cobain will not be present. He is merely running his studio for rent for the extra money. July 2001. Kurt finally attends one of PJ Harvey's shows at the tail end of her US tour. It's a question in everyone's minds why Kurt didn't attend more of her shows to support her. It simply just wasn't on his mind. It had nothing against Harvey herself. Kurt just hasn't been in a musical state of mind as of late. The last project he actually worked on was a couple months ago with Paul McCartney. And he only did that because that was the one time that made him feel like he was part of the Beatles. The collaboration with Elliott Smith had nothing to do with Kurt. They were Elliott's songs, and Kurt simply just produced them. Kurt wasn't a fan of PJ Harvey's supporting acts. On the final leg of her US tour, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds accompanied her for support, which Kurt found odd, seeing as how Nick Cave was PJ's ex-boyfriend whom she broke up with in 1997, just months before she met Kurt. He really didn't want to go through this whole ex-boyfriend thing that he went through with Courtney again, so at this time, he chooses to bite his lip and just hope for the best. Harvey is visibly happy to see Kurt backstage, but it is clear by the final leg of her tour, she's over it and wants to go home. And while she's not necessarily ignoring Kurt, it's clear to Kurt she has a lot going on and isn't fully reciprocating his affection towards her. He begins to overthink a lot. And starts to believe that this is due to the argument they had. Nick Cave introduces himself to Kurt backstage and says that he's heard a lot about him and always wanted to meet him, since Nevermind came out back in 1991. Cobain makes small talk, but it's clear he has no intentions of becoming friends with Nick. By the end of the show, Kurt and Polly drive out to her hotel room, where they are to stay the night. It's this night that Cobain confronts PJ Harvey about inviting Nick Cave along with her tour, to which she claims it was set up by management, and that she has no feelings for him. She also goes on to say that it was more about having bad seeds than Nick himself. Kurt hates this back and forth and anything to do with ex-boyfriends. He knows about it all too well from being married to Courtney. He chooses to not start an argument, and the two try to enjoy the rest of their evening. Upon arriving back to London with PJ Harvey, she notices the house is virtually untouched, as if Kurt just leaves his mess laying around and doesn't clean it up. He's known for being like that to his close friends. But Harvey was left unaware, and she doesn't intend to live like that. Another soft argument breaks out, and Kurt doesn't want to listen to her nag at him about cleaning the house, even though it's her house and she has every right to do so. Kurt abruptly changes the subject and says he has to prepare to fly back out to the US in the next week to pick up his daughter. Harvey doesn't comment. She simply just leaves the room. In the end of July 2001, while back in London with PJ Harvey and Francis, Kurt attempts to contact George Harrison, to no avail at this time, although Kurt will attempt to try again later. Francis tells Kurt that she promised Courtney she'd go back out to LA to be with her mother for her birthday in August, but she intends to call her father on her birthday. Cobain reluctantly agrees again and offers to fly out with her to the United States. He doesn't want to get nannies involved, and he can't stand the thought of his 9-year-old daughter flying alone. But it's clear Kurt is annoyed with the constant air travel, and just wants to stay put in one spot for as long as he can. PJ Harvey at this time is unaware that Kurt has been meeting with Courtney himself, and that the two have actually spoken to each other recently. August 2001. Kurt and Francis fly out to LA to see Courtney before Francis' birthday. She intends to spend much of the month with her mother, shopping, as well as catching up and making up for lost time together. Upon arriving at the airport, Courtney herself is there to meet Kurt and Francis. At that same time, the three are bombarded by paparazzi and over a dozen photos of the family are taken. Unbeknownst to Kurt, he didn't expect this, nor did he want him and his daughter, as well as his ex-wife, being photographed together inside of the airport. This was the ultimate invasion of privacy for him. He knew how the media would twist and turn every little detail to fit their narrative. This incident further driving Kurt's hatred for the United States. No matter what he does or where he goes in the US, it's always some kind of invasion of privacy when he gets there, and he's absolutely sick of it. It's not like London, where he can freely walk the streets, every now and then being noticed by a fan who greets him and moves on with their day. He feels like when he enters the US, it's a full-on assault from everyone who just wants a piece of him. Kurt and Courtney and Francis quickly get to the car waiting for them outside the airport. After dropping off Francis with Courtney, Kurt takes off in a taxi back to his house outside of LA. It's dark and rainy, and Kurt just wants to get home and take some pills and pass out for a bit. He told PJ Harvey he'd call her when he gets to his house. Unfortunately, he forgets to do so, and she waits for a phone call she never receives. Phone calling back and forth between the US and UK is expensive, and the time change doesn't seem to be working for any of the parties involved. A lot of people had tried to convince Kurt to get online and start using things like MSN Messenger or AOL to be able to keep in frequent contact, without the long distance cost or the time change. But Kurt neglected to agree to that and continues calling people like the old days. It's becoming a hassle for people trying to get a hold of him because he either doesn't answer the phone or he forgets to call. So as far as his friends are concerned, Kurt is one of the worst people to try to get a hold of. Kurt has been relatively off everyone's radar for almost a full year since Christotomy came out. People have stopped caring about that album and what Kurt is going to do musically. By this time, come the fall of 2001, the world of music has changed and moved on without him. On her birthday, Frances calls her father at his home outside of LA. She is now 9 years old. On the same day, Kurt is contacted by Buzz Osborne of Melvins, who asks Kurt if he wants to try again at producing their newest project. It's well known Kurt was credited as co-producer on Melvin's 1993 album Houdini, but was more or less ejected from the project after not showing up for a session, presumably due to drug abuse. Kurt and Buzz remained friends for the last couple years, but haven't hung out often. Cobain tells Osborne he'll think about it, since he hasn't really produced any records as of late. August 28th, 2001. Kurt receives a call from PJ Harvey who tells him they need to talk. Immediately, Kurt gets a bad feeling and isn't looking forward to it, creating more anxiety. Around this time, Kurt's studio versions of the songs he purposely left off Christotomy have begun to leak online, presumably due to someone who has rented his studio space, finding the tracks, and leaking them. The issue here is there's been so many different artists and producers coming and going in the past year, he would have a hard time tracking who leaked the tracks. But with Kurt being in the UK and virtually not online, he has no idea that this is happening. September 2001. On September 3rd, Kurt flies back to London to Harvey's house. He's excited to come back, but isn't excited about the quote-unquote talk she wants to have. When he finally gets back to London, he's clearly tired and out of it. He isn't very talkative, and he just wants to go to bed. But Harvey wants to get this talk out of the way. She begins by telling Kurt he needs to be more honest with her. She saw the tabloid photos of him and Courtney with Frances and can't understand why he didn't just tell her he was meeting with Courtney himself. She's mad that he freaked out at her about Nick Cave being on her US tour, but then immediately goes and hangs out with his ex-wife. She saw it as the ultimate spiteful move on his behalf and can't understand where this is all coming from. It's a side of him she's never seen. They've been pretty good together since they started seeing each other, close to 4 years ago at this time. She's also very upset that Kurt is not clean when it comes to his living situation. And she's not happy with the fact that he just leaves his mess where it is, even leaving behind a bottle of pills, which she described as quote-unquote, very sloppy. It's at this time Kurt comes clean to her and admits he still struggles with drug addiction. He has been off heroin for close to 7 years at this point, but he feels like he still needs something, even if it's just to help him sleep. He has addictive tendencies and is always at the grasp of something to make him feel better. He hasn't worked on music since late 1999, early 2000, and he's just been sitting around being sloppy and popping pills. PJ Harvey tells Kurt that she can't save him from himself. There's nothing she can do. And she then tells him, quote unquote, Kurt, you need to do something. When she says that, it sticks with him and bums him out in a way that he didn't think was possible from PJ Harvey. He's starting to realize that she's right, and it's all his fault. By September 2001, Kurt is beginning to feel like he's at the end of his rope again, much like he felt in late 1993, early 1994, except this time he's not on heroin. It's everything else around him seemingly falling apart. He feels like nobody cares about him anymore. His own daughter opted to spend time with her mother rather than him, even though in Frances' eyes it's nothing against Kurt, but more so she needs to spend time with both parents. Kurt doesn't see this way in his mind. He sees it as his daughter not caring anymore. He knows he pissed his entire fan base off with his last quote-unquote album, and now he's beginning to feel like PJ Harvey doesn't care anymore either, since she basically told him there's nothing she can do. He's not feeling the support he knows he needs. September 9th, 2001. After yet another argument with PJ Harvey about his drug use, Kurt gets up and says, quote-unquote, "That's it. I'm done. I don't have the mental capacity to talk about this right now." And he leaves the house. He books a hotel room for the night and tries to call George Harrison again just because he has his number. He doesn't know what to do or where to go. George doesn't answer yet again. And Kurt believes George knows it's him calling and doesn't care, so he stops trying. He calls Paul McCartney to let him know that he's flying back out to the US tomorrow and that might not be back to finish their quote-unquote project that they started. Paul tells Kurt to disregard that idea, take a moment to cool off and call his girlfriend, and then come to his house and they can talk about it if he chooses to. Kurt agrees. He cancels his flight to the US and heads to Paul's house for the night. He neglects to call PJ Harvey at this time. Cobain does spend the next couple days at Paul's house without giving PJ Harvey a call. He's still pretty upset about their last conversation and how she talked to him about the problems he's having that he seemingly has no control over in his eyes. September 11th, 2001. It's no surprise what this day brings us, in our real timeline as well as this timeline. 9/11 will not change. In this timeline, Kurt is at Paul McCartney's house during the attacks. In the United States, the attacks happened early in the morning, around 9 a.m. In the UK, it's 2:30 in the afternoon. At the time of the attacks, Kurt and Paul are sitting and discussing a project they've been working on, as well as talking about Paul being the middleman to help Kurt finally meet one of his heroes, George Harrison. They are abruptly cut off by Paul's girlfriend at the time, who comes downstairs and says, quote-unquote, "You need to turn on the television." Paul turns on the television, and the two are completely in awe of what they are seeing on the screen. 2 hijacked airplanes have flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. Kurt immediately calls PJ Harvey and tells her to turn on the TV if she hasn't yet. He tells her he will be there as soon as possible. This is the first time they've spoken since their last argument. Kurt had a strong feeling America was doomed since he left, but never had any idea something as bad as this could ever happen, and he is deeply bothered by what he sees on the screen. He can't believe anybody would willingly take the lives of so many people at one time, in one place. Cobain tells Paul, quote-unquote, "I have to go see her," referencing his need to see PJ Harvey. Paul agrees and says he'll be in touch soon. Kurt would arrive back at Harvey's house and they would reconcile for the time being, but it's still clear there's a little bit of animosity. The exact contents of the argument they had are still unclear at this point. September 12th, 2001. The world is grieving. It's been a full 24 hours since the attacks on American soil. It's all over the news. It's the only thing in the media. It has completely taken over the world. Kurt calls some friends back in the US as well as Courtney and Frances, just to check in with everyone. At this time, Kurt is planning on flying back to the US in the next week to be back at his home studio outside of LA to gather up more of his things. But now it's looking like the airlines might be backed up in the light of recent events. So at this time he decides he will remain in London, while Frances remains in LA with her mother. Cobain gives McCartney a call, and the two schedule a meet in the beginning of October. By the end of September, Cobain and Harvey have more or less made up. Things seem to be getting back to normal with their lives and the relationship they have built together. Although Kurt is often lazing around the house not really doing anything musically or artistically, he probably hasn't even picked up his guitar all month. PJ starts to notice this and tells Kurt he needs to do something. He can't live like this forever. He's becoming a shell of his former self, wasting away to nothing, far away from his friends and family. He has PJ Harvey and Paul McCartney, as well as Robert Smith occasionally, who he often tries to keep in contact with. But other than that small group of close friends, Kurt feels like he still has nothing. Harvey wants to help, but every time she tries to intervene with Kurt's issues, it turns into an argument. She feels like she's at the end of a rope with Kurt. All she can tell him is that he needs to do something. October 2001. In the beginning of the month, Kurt goes back over to Paul McCartney's house. When he arrives, Paul says he has something special to give to Kurt, and he hands Kurt a phone. On the other end of the line is George Harrison. Kurt can't believe it. He's actually talking to George Harrison. Although it's easy to tell George isn't well, he felt obligated to give Kurt the conversation he's been waiting to have since he first tried to call him. George knew Kurt was trying to contact him. He just couldn't take the previous calls due to his condition. But he knew who Kurt was and everything he's done, and was happy to talk to him. Kurt and George talk on the phone for a good half hour, and the two plan a meeting in person for some time during the holiday season. Around this time, Paul McCartney is beginning to organize the concert for New York City. October 7th, 2001. Paul calls Kurt once again and tells him about his idea for his benefit concert he's planning on putting together, much like he does in the real timeline. For those who don't know, the concert for New York City was a benefit concert that took place at Madison Square Garden in New York City in response to the September 11th attacks. Aside from performing for charity, the concert was an attempt to honor the first responders from the New York City Fire Department and New York City Police Department, their families, and those lost in the attacks, and those who have worked in the ongoing rescue and recovery efforts in the weeks since that time. It was organized by Paul McCartney in our real timeline. This doesn't change in this timeline, except now Paul McCartney and Kurt Cobain have become close friends over the past year or so. Paul asks Kurt if he wants to perform at the show. Kurt respectfully declines. Kurt isn't interested in playing any songs on the show, but offers to help organize the event, which is only 2 weeks away at this point. Paul says to Kurt, quote unquote, "Well, if you don't want to play, maybe you can call that drummer fellow of yours and his band can play." Paul was referring to Dave Grohl, who Kurt hasn't spoken to in almost 6 years. Kurt explains that to Paul, who brushes it off and says, quote unquote, "Well, call someone who has talked to him and get me that band. The world needs some good rock music right now." Kurt laughs it off but isn't quite sure how to feel about it. He tells Paul he's coming over tomorrow, and on October 8th, Kurt arrives back at Paul's house to further discuss the show. Paul continues to tell Kurt he should just get a band together and do the show for him. He didn't really want to. All Kurt could hear in his head was PJ Harvey saying, "You have to do something." It kept repeating and repeating. It's at this point Kurt makes a decision. Later that day, Kurt calls Dave Grohl. Dave answers immediately. It's been nearly 6 years since they've talked to each other. After a bit of small talk, Kurt asks if Foo Fighters are available to do a benefit concert for New York. Kurt knew Paul could have called Dave himself. Kurt knew Paul wanted him to call Dave to reconnect. He knew it in his heart that that's what this was about. During the conversation, Dave Grohl says Foo Fighters unfortunately cannot play the benefit due to unforeseen health conditions, but since the show is still 2 weeks away, he told Kurt that the band is always in ready shape to play and will keep him updated on the condition of the band as they get closer to the date of the show. Kurt and Dave talk on the phone for well over an hour. Dave is very happy to hear from Kurt at this time. October 20th, 2001. The day of the concert for New York City. The concert is jam-packed with acts including many legendary British contemporaries, including The Who, David Bowie, Elton John, Eric Clapton, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, as well as some American artists including Bon Jovi, Jay-Z, Destiny's Child, Backstreet Boys, Billy Joel, and the Goo Goo Dolls, as well as comedic acts by Adam Sandler, along with much, much more. Paul McCartney is set to headline the show, with each artist playing between 1 and 3 songs each. He set it up so there was music that would please every type of person across the world. All of this happens in our real timeline. In this timeline, however, there is one added act to the list. The Who played 3 of their biggest hits before ending their short set list. Pete Townsend would take the mic and say, quote unquote, "Yeah, you've been waiting for this one." Before Paul McCartney comes out to finish the show, there is one more band set to open for him. This band is Nirvana. Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, and Dave Grohl walk out onto the stage. There's an acoustic setup as well as electric guitars off to the side. The crowd doesn't roar like you'd expect from an unannounced Nirvana reunion. But this isn't that kind of show. The atmosphere is more sad and emotional, no matter how hard the rock can be. But it is absolutely breathtaking to see these 3 men on stage together for the first time in almost 8 years. Nirvana, as this band, hasn't played a show since March of 1994. They are set to play 3 back-to-back songs. But I will not decide what songs those are. I want you guys to decide what songs Nirvana played had they reunited for one time only at the concert for New York in 2001. I want to open this as a discussion amongst us, and I would love to hear what 3 songs from any era of Nirvana would fit into such an important show. Let me know in the comments. To understand how this Nirvana reunion came to be, we do have to rewind a bit to mid-October of 2001. After Kurt called Dave about Foo Fighters playing the gig, Dave said they can't due to health reasons. But what I did not mention before is that Dave said he has a better idea, and that's where the discussion of Nirvana doing the show came into play. Kurt had PJ Harvey saying, "You have to do something," on constant repeat in his head during the whole conversation, and he took it as a sign that this is the time to do something. As for Dave, he's been waiting for Kurt to contact him someday. He didn't want to be the one to do it. He never hated Kurt and had nothing against him. In fact, he missed Kurt dearly. So the conversation they had on the phone was an easy one. Chris Novoselic was an easy sell. He's been talking about a Nirvana reunion for quite some time and always hinted at it in very subtle ways, but never came to fruition. He even said it would never happen. He has also remained in close contact with Kurt and has spoken to Dave a handful of times throughout the years. Pat Smear wasn't contacted. It's well known by all parties that he's not interested in doing anything musically at the moment, while he focuses on family. With the show being only 2 weeks away, Nirvana gave themselves 1 week to prepare for the show, starting rehearsals on October 13th, 2001. None of them seemed to be worried about preparation time, with Dave saying, quote unquote, "We're fucking Nirvana. We don't need to practice." They would meet up at Kurt's place outside of LA to jam. The same studio Rohypnol was recorded in 1996. Dave Grohl was later noted as saying, quote unquote, "It was like riding a bike." The attitude is all positive this time around. All 3 members felt like kids again playing these songs. Everyone was just happy to see each other. Kurt and Dave have been away from each other so long. Whatever animosity they had is just out the window. And with Kurt being off heroin, everyone just gets each other and the personalities match, just like the old days. As for the show itself, Kurt got to meet a lot of people he's been wanting to meet but never got the chance to, largely in part to Paul McCartney setting up the show and inviting his friends. Kurt finally got to meet David Bowie and Eric Clapton, as well as members of The Who. Novoselic would say, quote unquote, "Kurt picked David Bowie's brain for at least an hour." Paul convinced Kurt to call Dave on purpose, in hopes that the two would eventually reconnect. He would later be noted as saying, quote unquote, "I always wanted to join Nirvana, but I knew I couldn't if that band didn't exist." November 2001. Kurt goes back to PJ Harvey's house. He's in a different mood than he was before he previously left in October. He had to do something and he felt like he did just that. He went out and helped put together a memorial concert. He helped bring together thousands of people and artists alike. He was even able to bring together an old group of friends from his heyday in the 90s. He successfully brought Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic back together, as well as himself, contrary to what he always said he would never do. He brought Nirvana back for one show. He brought Nirvana back for 3 songs, for a good cause, the only type of situation that could ever have brought that band back together. It wasn't about money or egos or songwriting. All of the negative things associated with that band were gone. It was potentially the most positive experience Nirvana has ever had since the band was conceived. Kurt has been adamant since the show happened that it was a one-off. He had no intentions on reforming that band. He has no intentions on continuing and doing more shows as Nirvana. He does, however, claim that him and Dave Grohl are friends again, and plans to keep in contact in the future. But as for Nirvana, he claims it'll never happen again. Cobain and Harvey are on better terms than they were at the beginning of the year, partially due to her not being on tour and him not having to spend most of his time alone. Cobain swears to Harvey that the Courtney images she saw meant nothing. It was taken by paparazzi. He never spent any time with Courtney and hasn't planned to. It was simply a mistake, and he is sorry for not being more open about what he was doing. As for the drugs, Kurt tells PJ that he's trying to detox himself. But Kurt knows that's not true, and he still intends to take some sleeping pills when he needs them. At the tail end of the month, another tragedy strikes Kurt's life. The death of George Harrison, who passed away from complications from cancer. Paul phones Kurt to give him the news, and Kurt is absolutely devastated. He and George had made plans to finally meet in person sometime in December, but unfortunately, George couldn't hang in long enough for that to happen. So ultimately, Kurt never gets to meet George. He's happy he got that conversation on the phone with him when he did, and regrets not planning a date sooner. Cobain and Harvey will attend the funeral together. December 2001. Not much changes by December of 2001. The world is still grieving the September 11th attacks in New York, as well as George Harrison's death 2 months later. Kurt remains in the UK with PJ Harvey and his daughter, who has returned to spend time with the couple for the holidays. It's a slow month filled with mourning and emotions. Kurt doesn't want to find himself sitting around and doing nothing. He's still happy about what he was able to accomplish back in October with the concert for New York, and he's happy about his newfound relationship with Dave Grohl. It feels different this time. It's not even about music. The two can sit and talk and hang out without even mentioning music. They're past that. Everyone is older now and more mature. Kurt is about to be 35 years old in the next few months. Everyone's lives have changed. Kurt's life has become mundane, reclusive, and out of the spotlight. The world of music media, MTV, and Much Music are all over the fact that Nirvana reunited at the concert for New York. It's been nothing but speculation on the band getting back together since. But with pretty much all members involved stating that it was a one-off and probably won't happen again. And to enjoy it for what it is. The DVD will be released in the new year where fans can watch the performance. Other than that, Kurt, Dave, and Chris have all said that it was for a good cause and Nirvana won't return as a full-time band. On the contrary to what all members of the band have said previously, on Christmas Eve 2001, Kurt is back at his home outside of LA. There, he is joined by Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl. They jam a handful of songs at Kurt's home studio. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2001. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2002. Please remember to discuss what you think Nirvana would have played at the concert for New York in the comments.